So I want to address a little bit a different topic, which is actually a topic that is present across many of the talks. I was very inspired today. And by the way, I want to thank the organizer for inviting me. So I want to speak about data, because data generated at the edge is something that also is very important for a power grid. And I want to look at that from a point of view of solution that can enable us to access those data through the National Science Data Fabric. So if you look at the big picture, if you look at production in industry, research in academia, we have that more and more what we call discovery is fed by data generated at the edge. And what we observe also in this scenario is that while the problem becomes more and more complex, and we expect that if today the problem is complex, tomorrow will be even further complex. The system we are dealing with, and this is not just computing system, but could be the power grid, is becoming more and more heterogeneous. What remain the big question is, what about the data access and usability on this, for this problem and this system? Because what we will see is the access and usability will substantially diminish as we move towards the future. And so the problem, the general problem, is that we need to make data generated at the edge for citizens and enable us, user of this data, to have a timely access and an impactful use of such data. And that was also the problem that, together with Valerio Pascucci, who is here, we tried to address, and we came together with other collaborators at university like San Diego Supercomputer Center, Johns Hopkins, and University of Michigan Ann Arbor. We came together to define the National Science Data Fabric, which is a data fabric, it's a cyber infrastructure that allow us to access data generated in facility. And when you think about facility, think about in your context, which would be actually a distributed network of power grids and connection of such power grids. So we are looking to access of data that are generated in facility at runtime and use them as they are generated. So when we speak about the solution, we need to look at two different types of components. The software in the background that allow you indeed to access and use this data. And so here on your right, you see our software stack that we have been developing from the National Science Data Fabric. But we also need to think who are our users, people like you. And in this case, we need to think about services that are easy to deploy and allow you to use the data. And so on your left, you have a list of services that the National Science Data Fabric has been developing and make available to the user. And so if we look at those services and we look them in action, here are examples of environment or project in which the National Science Data Fabric has been instrumental. And I took the freedom to add also your project, which is the Wired. So you see here the National Science Data Fabric has been instrumental in empowering user in facility like the CHESS facility, which is the Cornell High Energy Synchrotron, to study dark matters, to address aspect of autonomous lab, to develop and support aspect of four-dimensional spatial biology, resilience power grid. It sounds familiar, doesn't it? And also AI-assisted cancer surgery, including also community access. So these are quite diverse and heterogeneous projects, and you are part of this big ecosystem. But what is common here is the National Science Data Fabric solutions, the software and the services. So let me tell you about a couple of examples and that are not in the power grid, but there is, as you will see, as we look at them very briefly, some sort of parallel with many of the needs that you may have. So she is Pania Nowell. She's a colleague at the University of Utah, and she is studying aspect of the porous silicon material, breaking point of this material. And what she used for this study is data from facility at Stony Brook's National Laboratory. In this case, she collects something like 100 terabytes of data from for experiments, and what is the challenge for her is not only to take the data out, but is that as she takes the data out, these data are analyzed and there is an explosion of data. So something that is 100 terabytes of data become 400 terabytes in the process of analyzing them. And so the National Science Data Fabric was able to enable her to access this data through the cloud, and was able to use a combination of private and public cloud like AWS and the Cloud Lab, which are free from fee access cloud in the United States, to create indeed an environment where she could do the analysis of this data. She's Amy Roberts. She has University of Colorado, Denver. She studied dark matter. I think that Amy is a fantastic person to speak about this topic. She's able to convince you that have to be a high priority research and investment because of the excitement she has about this topic. Dark matter is indeed something that can have a big implication, but at this point it's a challenge to collect this data and study this data. These data are collected 2 kilometers under the soil in Canada, by the way, in the snow lab, as you see here. And these data are one-dimensional, long data that looks quite boring, but embedded in this one-dimensional data, there are signals that are unique, and that is where the challenge is, how to find that. And so we have been working with Amy to find not only design the interfaces, but also integrate this interface with the data, where the data are, so that she and other colleagues can do their analysis, can do the science without having concern about how to access and how to analyze the data. They are Kate and Suki. They are at the Cornell High Energy Synchrotron Quantum Materials Research and Facility Center. This is a facility center that is the only center in US that is not part of a national lab. It's at the university. It's on a small scale. They have only 6 beamline, and they rent this beamline to scientists. So the process for them is to support scientists to come in, get an allocation of 1 day or 1 week. The scientists come for material science experiment, real experiments. And what is that happen is that there is a continuous monitoring and steering of this experiment driven by humans at this point. When we came on board and start working with them, what happened is that we instrumented this facility at the edge so that now they can steer the experiment at runtime to simple interface like an iPhone, and they can monitor and extract statistics as the experiment evolves. So that is a big incentive and save of cost for the experiment. But one aspect of this type of collaboration with scientists at the edge is also that we learn from the small scale and expand to the big scale. And this is the last example I want to speak about, which is a collaboration with the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. This is a national lab where we have a similar infrastructure like at CHESS, but on a larger scale. So here we go from 6 beamline to 33 beamlines. And the addition of the challenge here is that we not only want to study at runtime the statistic, but we want also to inject AI to help us to define what is the next step of my experiment at runtime. So in this context, we are studying a type of iron oxide that has specific feature, a specific temperature. And so here, in the past, we had the scientists guessing the temperature and entering at runtime the temperature in the system for the next step of the experimental collection of data. So what we did with the National Science Data Fabric is to instrument the process of the experiment, steering and collecting data, but we also added in this context the AI component. So we were using AI to infer what is the next temperature we want to do in our experiment. And so with that in mind, the part that is also very exciting for us is that because we have collected so much experience with many of you and other colleagues across domain, we are now in a point in which the National Science Data Fabric is mature, in which we can connect with the user, and in 5 months we can provide a solution. Like in this case, the collaboration with the Oak Ridge National Laboratory started in January. We discussed what were their needs. We instrumented their facility and adapt the National Science Data Fabric for the specific need they had. And so we had the first experiment that was successful already in May. So you see that we learn, we apply, we expand, we apply to a different scale that can be from a small to a large. This thanks to the many needs that different science and colleagues from different science are providing to us. So this is an example in which you see in the video that there is the AI guessing or inferring the next temperature. We look at the facility where this temperature is introduced. And last but not least, in the video, you see that we are moving to the National Science Data Fabric interface that has been designed specifically for this type of experiments. And so you have these 3 components that work together in concert. So we are so excited that this is the next experiment we are conducting. So the component of heterogeneity of the system we are dealing with is a key part of our research. And so we want to scale and we want to apply in different contexts. So this is a different type of beamline, different experiments. With that in mind, I want you to invite to think about what I have told you, examples that are probably not what is your passion, but try to see if there is a parallel, and I'm sure it is there because I know this project, this fantastic project, I've been learning so much in this day, is already considering and using the National Science Data Fabric. But think about what are your needs and how could a suite of services allow me to make the accessibility of my data at the edge more effective. And in that case, perhaps if you have question or if you have idea or if you have suggestion, please reach out to me and Valerio. Valerio is here, and tomorrow he will speak about AI and data as well. And with that, thank you.
All right, so we've heard from the system operator standpoint as well, and like a lot on the transmission side. Like luckily for me, one of my colleagues was on a panel earlier talking about kind of like what FortisAlberta does and stuff like that. But we're a distribution only utility. But the question is, how, like when you're looking at it from a DER space, FortisAlberta actually is one of the most heavily penetrated networks. Like it is the most heavily penetrated network in the country. But it's actually one of the most heavily penetrated networks in all of North America as well. Where we're unique though is we actually have very large DER plants compared to say like some other jurisdictions. Like I mean, even California, for example, has they're more distributed as opposed to like single plants. For us, we get a lot of like single plants that are very large that are connected to distribution. So the question is, how do we go and leverage some of these technologies in order to be able to actually, increase our system resiliency? This is where it becomes kind of interesting. Now, I've got a little bit of an outline of some of the things that I'm just going to quickly cover. But again, what I want to put in perspective for people here is FortisAlberta itself only services roughly 28% of the total system load of Alberta, but we have more than 60% of the DERs connected to the network. So is it like proportion-wise, like we're completely out to lunch. So we have situations where we have plants that are 25 megawatts-ish or around that front, and the load's only 500 kilowatts for that feeder. So basically at that point, you're almost just a straight T-connect. That's to put in perspective. But because we've got so many of these, we've started looking at, well, how do we leverage these? And some of these things we are already doing. This is a program that we're currently looking at doing. It hasn't been fully rolled out yet, but essentially what we're trying to do is we're looking at how can we leverage DER to service what we call an unsupplied load. So in this situation, we got four transformers across multiple substations necessarily. What happens if we lose one of those substations? can we actually look at it and go, okay, well, we have a generator on one feeder. Can I actually just tie the second feeder to the first feeder and actually service the load, even if the substation capacity doesn't exist? So it seems like a really simple concept, right? But the problem is there's contracts you got to set up, you got to figure out the right payment mechanisms. On a technical basis, you got to say, okay, well, what's changing from a technical standpoint? Do I need to rerun studies? It can get quite complicated. So this is a program that we're currently working through right now. We're having a little bit of a hiccup in terms of trying to get the actual pricing mechanism sorted out, but from a technical basis, we think we've kind of got this one solved. So I'm not going to go into too much detail on it. It's just kind of a high level, but yeah, this is one of the ways that we can look at it. The big thing that we're having issues with, and one thing that's not necessarily an issue, but things that we're having to manage, is DER ancillary service participation. Now, a lot of you, as many of you are aware, the AESO here is very aggressively procuring ancillary services, and DER is a part of this mix. Now, it makes sense. As I said, we need to increase our resiliency and increase our reliability. Well, not sort of reliability, but resiliency in particular. But the tricky part from a DFO standpoint is, typically speaking, from a technical basis, operating mechanisms are much tighter, and that's what makes this extremely difficult. So FFR in particular is one of them. When you go and look and see what that does to a distribution system, when you inject, say, a 20 megawatt battery in less than 200 milliseconds, it does a lot to the network. So distribution systems are inherently a lot weaker than a transmission system. So this is where it becomes interesting. This is just a simple case study that we did when we were first figuring out how do we actually generate requirements around FFR. You can actually see here, this is the same generator. So this case is the exact same generator, and we just tweaked the system metrics, so what the system conditions were. So you can actually see when this generator comes in and ramps in, you can basically overvolt the system depending on the conditions, and you can actually tank the voltage as well. So I've written a handful of papers on this topic already. For those that are interested, you can go and read them. But basically, it's essentially it makes it tricky from our standpoint, which is why we have to develop these screening methodologies, very significant amounts of studies in order to be able to make this work. But this is a mandate that we need to be able to meet in order to be able to facilitate these resiliencies. In short, when it comes to fast frequency response, and this is probably generic for most ancillary services, it's very much a factor of like what is the substation capacities, what is your substation configuration at the time. So like X and R ratio, it matters a lot. What is the system strength? That matters a lot to us as well. And even DER operating modes. Some of the operating modes are significantly more stable when you're operating in these kinds of markets than compared to some other modes. The modes we currently use are constant power factor. That mode does not work very well when it comes to these types of markets. So we're moving to more dynamic control modes. This is where it becomes very interesting. This is where, like, I always say to people, it's like I did a lot on the research side, but I'm also an industry person as well. It's like this is the sort of stuff that my research hat, I sit here and I go like, oh, this is fantastic. I love doing this. From the practical standpoint, as the person that's working for the utility, this keeps me up at night. It makes it a lot harder to deal with. So it's like I'm trying to wrestle between two worlds in these situations. Another interesting one is grid forming inverters. Now, most of you should know, or most of you may know in the room, FortisAlberta has the Waterton microgrid in the very far south of the province. It was the first one of its kind, essentially, in the province. That's one of our grid forming inverters. Well, it's the only one that we own anyway, but there's other ones that are in the system. But basically, this is the traditional use for grid forming sources for distribution. It's for backup, essentially. That's when you would use it. But the thing is, you can extend this well beyond this. You can go well beyond just microgrids. You can actually use it for, you can even use it for system firming. You can use it for, to increase system stability as well. And this is where it kind of comes interesting. The next part is, I'm going to be completely frank, I ripped this from EPRI. This was a study that they did that we happened to get our hands on. This is looking at what happens when you have a weaker transmission system and you start leveraging grid forming, like say batteries. In this case, the battery solves the transmission problem. The system is now stable. Now we go and put in a large DER on the distribution side. and it actually makes the distribution system unstable, but it keeps the transmission side stable still. So this is the sort of things that we're looking at. Now, there's two options in these cases. One thing, you can increase the battery side on the transmission system, or you can put a battery on the distribution side. The amusing part is, in this situation, in order to increase the battery on the transmission system, you have to increase it like 3 or 4 times, which is significant cost. On the distribution side, you only have to put in a battery that was half the size of the actual DER in order to be able to solve the problem. So this is where I'm saying it gets interesting, because from a distribution standpoint and a transmission standpoint, the two entities need to be talking to each other to figure out what is the most economical solution in these kinds of instances. So this is why I said grid forming sources is a hot topic. I just came back from the general meeting last week, and it was non-stop panel after panel after panel, all on grid forming technologies. So this is a very big hot topic for us. In terms of future considerations as well, when we're talking about the resiliency front, we're spending a huge amount of time doing advanced screening methods and advanced studies types of methods as well. We're also looking at leveraging grid forming inverters for a lot of other applications. Microgrids obviously is the main one. Under-frequency load shedding. So like if we do get an under-frequency load shed event, we can back the whole system up, and then essentially no one loses their power for an event like that. Grid black starting, PSPS, wildfire, like making sure that critical infrastructure still has power, even though we may lose grid power in those situations. And very high penetration substations. So as I said, we've got some very, very high penetration substations in our system at the moment. Some of them are 80 megawatts plus. When these things start to interact with each other, they push and pull the system like you wouldn't believe. So using a grid forming source to try and help stabilize that, this is the sort of things that we're trying to look at. Now, from a regulatory standpoint, there is a few things to consider as well. There's a lot of frameworks that need to be developed to permit this sort of thing to occur. So what we're saying is, as a DFO, our ability to interact in some of those markets can be a little bit limited in some cases. So opening up those markets will actually make this a little bit easier. Advanced load modeling is another one as well, making sure that we actually understand what loads we have on our system. Distribution utilities are notorious for having very poor models on their loads. We do make a lot of assumptions, and how a load actually behaves compared to what the model says often is very different. So this is something that needs to be looked at. But yeah, with that, I'm gonna call it. I know it's hard and fast, but we'll go from there.
All right, so I understand that I am the persons between you and receptions, right? So I'm supposed to entertain you for the next 10 minutes, and hopefully I can share something that is beneficial for you or whatever, right? But at least it has to be entertaining. Now, first of all, thank you for being here. Thank you for inviting me. And my first information that I'm going to tell you is the fact that if you are a student here, make sure that you network, make sure that you make new friends, and don't upset people, because we all such a very, very, very close community, very close people. And I got here, I didn't even realize. This is my first time being in the University of Calgary, beautiful campus. When I walk here, it's like everybody's like, I've seen you before, I know you, I've met you. It's like, yes, that's why, I want to be nice to you, because you could be my boss next time, or you are my boss this time. You just never know. So make a full use. If you are not planning to be on the reception or networking, shame on you. You should actually plan to be there, because at the end of the day, it is a very, very close industry that everybody know everybody. Don't piss off anyone. So anyway, just really quick about California ISOs. I think many of you know California ISO is just exactly the same like Alberta ISO. So I'm not going to talk about what California is. It's the same thing. Maybe just a little bit different with regards to the facts of California ISO. It's one of the 9 ISO that we have in Northern America. So you see where California is, you see where Alberta is, and then there are other ISOs in the rest of Northern America, including Ontario have one as well. For California ISOs, back in California, we're about 52,000 megawatt of peak load. A lot of people, 32 million people, but majority is in the coast side. So that's what California ISO is. So that's California ISOs actually don't operate for the whole California. There is other, what we call the balancing authority. There's other utilities inside California ISO that is not within California ISO. Don't ask me politics, that's just California. So we're actually operating about 80% of California. The rest of 20% in California is not part of California ISO. So our balancing area is but that whatever color is. I don't know what the color that is. Somebody makes that slide, so it's that color. The rest of it is not California ISO. Now, but California ISOs also operate for what we call reliability coordinators. I think Brandon talks about reliability coordinators, and we operate what we call the RCOS. The RCOS is a reliability coordinator for a bigger chunk of Western interconnections, so maybe about 80% of it since 2019. So that's that bluish color that is in there. Now, we also operate energy imbalance market. What is that? That's just real-time market. The real-time market has that portions in there. So when you think about California ISO and my responsibility, my background is in the system operations. I grew up as an electrical power engineer, graduated with concentrations for electric powers and control. So that's kind of like my life. But I'm responsible for all these three, right? There is a balancing area where we balance the stuff, and there is a reliability coordinator for that footprint, and there's also this market footprint that is just really a real-time market, similar to what we have in the Alberta Electric AESO. They have real-time market similar to what we have in Ontario, where they also have a day-ahead and real-time market. So that's just the background. Let's talk about grid resiliency. I really like who was it? I think it was Brandon that says, whenever we talk about resiliency, we often get confused between reliability and resiliency. That was Brandon, I love that. Because people don't think about it that much, because reliability is a must. We gotta operate reliably. And we always say that, okay, yeah, it's okay. We have NERC standard. Jamie put together all these NERC standards. She doesn't want to say it's her standards. She always says that it's all of us creating the standards, but it's really Jamie's work. So anyway, I'm going to get trouble after this. But the reality is the reliability standard or reliability is something that is what I think of it as a minimum of what you really need to do. And when you start talking about resiliency, that's above the minimum requirement. Last night we were talking, and we said that, hey, if we spend money on resiliency, how much benefit are we getting? Well, hopefully we will never ever have to use all those stuff that we built. And then why do we build it? Well, it's for resiliency. Well, but that costs a lot of money. It's like, yeah, so how do you actually do this? Let me just talk a little bit about what is the grid resiliency to the impact of the extreme events. We've talked a lot about extreme event today, but I'm going to categorize it into three things. First is the energy resource. We do a lot of assessment of what we do when we have a forced outage of resources. There is a probabilistic methodology in there. Everybody knows about this. I'm not going to talk about it. It's the loss of load expectation calculation. We do probabilistic analysis assessment on that, and we say, okay, how much resource do we make sure do we have and invest so we can meet this? Okay, we do the probabilistic analysis. We also do stack analysis, and we basically say, okay, we need what we call a planning reserve margin. We need 22% planning reserve margin to get there so that we can actually cover that. Well, people say, that's too expensive. Okay, 17, 16, 15? Well, okay, what is the reliability need? The reliability need is to meet 1 and 2 load. Okay, but our load is all the time above 1 and 2 load. So what is your guarantee to meet your load? Well, of course, it's too expensive. So in California, I was just talking about this. It's kind of interesting because the California state says that, oh, we're just going to want to meet 1 and 2 load. That's our target procurement. But we'll create this state reliability reserve. The state actually pay for this. It's $5.2 billion above and beyond of stuff, and it's something that we could use to avoid emergency. But anyway, so money, right? It's going to cost money to actually have some type of a state reliability reserve. And we get to use this. We get to use this to avoid emergency, but it's not under normal reliability planning. It's something that is above and beyond what we would normally do. Okay, so the same thing with the transmission system availability. So if you've been around for some time, you probably heard what happened in the San Francisco Bay Area Metcalf substation that sniper shot hundreds and hundreds of rounds and basically damages 17 transformer. And we didn't have any blackout. And guess what? People always say that, some people say, well, that's very resilient. The other people say that, well, you're overbuilding your system. You could live without 17 transformer and without having any blackout. Okay, where do you want me to be? But at the end of the day, you have to think about this also. We've talked about the fact that we have a lot of wildfires. Wildfire continue to pose risk to the grid. We have the PSPS, the Public Safety Fire Shut-off. Thank you, Brandon. I don't have to explain what that is. It's great. It's basically utilities temporarily shutting off power. There is encroachment. I didn't put it even in there. That's actually new, very interesting, because the wildfires created its own atmosphere that could actually spark another transmission lines in another site. So they're basically says, let's shut off the power for that. So that's happening. So here is a statistic of wildfire in California. This is in acres. So if you are used to hectares, that's 0.42 in there. So you do your own calculation. Sorry, I live in United States. United States thinks that acres is the way to go. But this wildfire has been growing. So we have a lot of monitoring tool. This is the same monitoring tool that we've been seeing, so I'm not going to explain about it. Basically, a lot of fires get monitored. And we also have, who was it? I think Stephen that had the Alert West. We have the same thing. We just call it Alert California. The same people that use it, actually. I think UCSD generate AI to detect all the wildfires. Really good. But I'm going to leave with this one last PowerPoint. And I'm going to slow down a little bit here. Because the grid, the electric power grid, is transforming, right? So resiliency has become more and more complex because the environment itself is changing. So the energy resource profile is transforming. We have all the legacy resources that has coal, natural gas, and that's actually been transformed. It's in the process of transforming. In California, it's transformed a lot to largely inverter-based resources. We have 20-some thousand megawatt of solar. We have 13,000 megawatt of lithium-ion 4-hour battery. So changing. I haven't even talked about some of this battery-induced fire, right? Battery fire that happens in California. There's a lot of stuff that's going on in there. The extreme event itself occurring more frequent. Heat wave, heat dome, wildfires, aridifications. If you don't know what aridification is, Google it, ChatGPT it. Energy consumers profile is also transforming. We talked about large load, data center, electrification. So all three of these are changing. It becomes more complex. So when we talk about resilience, we got to think about how do we make this resilience. But at the end of the day, the money is also play the cost and affordability. So at the end of the day, I think working with research, university, if we could get anything that is actually get it more resilience at affordable costs, I think that would be great. Thank you.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and it's a pleasure to speak at this event, and thanks everybody for the time and the invite to participate. I guess I'm the next person between you and the reception, so I'll try to keep it short within the 10-minute mark. But I guess really what I wanted to talk about at the beginning is that I think, given all of our presentations so far, it's fair to say that our power industry is going through if not the biggest, one of the biggest changes and transformations in its entire history. So just to name a few changes that we have on the go right now. On the resource mix, we are transitioning from more and more share of the renewables and inverter-based resources, which is a paradigm and significant change from fossil fuel and synchronous-based generation. That's not to say that inverter-based resources are bad or good. They are just different from synchronous machines. And for a very, very long time, the way that we have planned the system, the way that we have operated the system, the way that we have modeled and studied the system have been based on the attributes and characteristics of the synchronous machines. So it's a really big shift for us to actually think about those attributes and reliability impacts of the change of the resource mix. So things like inertia, primary frequency response, system strength, short circuit levels, ramping issues. Jamie talked about the more and more need in the morning about the electromagnetic transient modeling and studies. So that's part of the transition to the inverter-based generation that we have to be mindful about as we go through this grid transformation. On the load side, I think data centers are a hot topic in pretty much every jurisdiction these days. Here in Alberta, we have 17.5 gigawatt applications in our connection queue just for the data centers. And just to put the numbers in the context, our peak demand in the system right now is about 12.4 gigawatt. So that means that we have 1.5 times applications just for the data centers in the connection queue compared to our peak demand. And just like all of those things are not enough to deal with on their own, we have the climate change to be mindful. So we see more and more extreme weather events. They happen more often, they last longer, and they leave more impact on the grid. So all that, it has put all of us on the utility side, especially the system operators, to simply keep the lights on in a more cost-effective manner. But I'm not here to complain about my job and how difficult my job is. But as we all know, challenges create opportunities, and I'm here to talk about some of the observations that we have with respect to extreme weather events in the province and what we are doing about those. So before I dive into the resiliency stuff, I just want to talk about very briefly who we are and what we do. The snip on the top right, essentially we have 4 main functions in the province. We connect the customers to the grid, so every generation or load project on the transmission side or even on the distribution side, depending on their size, they have to go through the AESO's connection process to get connected to the grid. We are also a planner. We have the transmission planning and planning coordination functionality in Alberta, so we plan for the transmission system. We also operate the grid, and also we have the market function, so we have the energy and ancillary service market that we plan, design, and operate. We are a non-for-profit organization. We are independent system operator, as the name says. We don't have any assets, so we don't own lines, we don't own generation, we don't own distribution. And at the end of the day, we are responsible for the safe, reliable, economic planning of the grid for the purpose of the Alberta public. Just a few stats about our system. I won't go through everything on this slide, but just to highlight a few. Like I mentioned, our peak demand is about 12.4 gigawatt. This is the record that we set back in January 2024 in that cold snap event that Brandon also talked about in the morning. We are a winter peaking jurisdiction. Our summertime peak is getting close, but we are still peaking in the winter time. On the resource mix, this is essentially the share of our capacity, and right now we are sitting around 61% for the gas-fired generation, so things like simple cycle units, combined cycle, cogen, gas-fired, around 32% renewable, 4% hydro, and so on. What I really wanted to highlight here is that we used to be a coal-dominated province up to about 10 years ago. And with the provincial and federal policies, all of those coal plants have been either retired or converted to the steam unit. In fact, the last coal unit we had in the province was converted to a steam unit last year as part of the Capital Power Genesee repowering project. And now we are essentially looking at the gas as our main fuel source for our dispatchable generation. So when it comes to those interdependency between the natural gas system and the electricity system, it's really important for us to think about and be mindful of those interdependency between the natural gas and generation. because essentially right now, over 90% of our dispatchable generation use natural gas as a fuel source, and we really want to make sure that when it comes to dark and cold nights in the winter time, when the sun is not shining and the wind is not blowing, we have enough supply in the system to be able to meet the demand. So we have been talking a lot about the wildfires, and I guess I didn't want to be left out in that conversation, so I just wanted to talk about some of our observations about what we have seen from the grid perspective during the wildfire events in the last few years. So by all means, this is not to be meant to be an inclusive list of all of those events and observations, but I just wanted to highlight some of those key experiences that we've had seen in the province. So when it comes to wildfires, there are obviously direct impacts that, when things are burning, we have damage or even complete destruction of the poles on the transmission system, usually the wooden poles, but also the metal structures could get impacted and damaged, which means that we have outages on the transmission line or the transmission system, and we have to deal with that operationally, including those, N-X type of condition. We also have indirect impact, which is perhaps a bit less obvious, but it's more about pollution and air quality. I think Stephen from ADCO touched on that in the last panel in the Q&A session. But we have seen some substation equipment outages that when we have so much smoke and ash in the air, it plugs up the filters or the ventilation system within the substations, and that causes some of the major equipment within the substations to be out. So we have seen things like FACT devices, SPCs, tripping off, or synchronous condensers, which is essentially causing us some grief in their operations side to be able to manage the voltages and reactive power resources. We've also seen installation contamination, so insulators get contaminated, and they cause essentially risk of flashover on the transmission line, and also on the generation facilities. Some impact again on the thermal plants. Again, air filters get plugged up. Thermal plants have to come offline because the air is just so dirty for the gas fire generation to burn. And also some field staff access issues. So we've had situations where transmission lines have been out for several months, and it's just because the transmission owner and operator didn't have road access issue to be able to make repairs and get the lines back in service. And then on the kind of extreme temperature side, cold and heat, I think it was talked about in the morning about some of the supply adequacy considerations. So we see more and more demand during the extreme cold and extreme heat event. There are some impact on the generation facilities in terms of outages or derates with respect to equipment either freezing or overheating, that type of stuff. And also the natural gas availability that, in our system in Alberta, our natural gas system peaks in the winter time as well, just like the electricity system. And, in the winter time, when it's too cold, things break, things like, compressors on the natural gas transmission, and that causes some derates or some restrictions on the thermal plants in the province. There are also some impact on the transmission system, things like breakers, low SF6 gas, low oil, high temperature, derates, and also some field staff safety and consideration about being able to do work outside when it's too hot or too cold. So now the question becomes, what do we do about that? So in my role within the company, as I'm being asked continuously, what are we doing in the resiliency space? I always go back to the principles and the concept of the resilience in the first place. So I think the other presenters talked about that as well today, but resiliency in my mind, which is arguably a simple mind, is about being prepared before the event happens. As the event happens, respond to that, and after that, recover from that event and restore the system. So when it comes to the preparedness, so things could be about determining and assessing the threats on the system, reducing vulnerabilities and exposure to the extent possible. when it comes to the event response, things like real-time assessment and real-time coordinations with the other entities to really contain and limit the impact on the system, and then to recover. So these things tend to leave some impact on the system, so you have to be able to recover from that. And also, as you go through the whole process, you have to be able to essentially go back, see what you have observed, learn from it, and make improvements moving forward. So that's kind of a full cycle that defines the resiliency. So with that in mind, what do we do from the AESO's perspective and how our activities and plan fits into that overall resiliency space? Just a few examples, again, not to be meant conclusive, but just some high level of what we do. So there are things like system planning aspect. Jamie in the morning talked about some of the TPL standards that NERC has been working on, TPL1 and TPL8 as an example. So those standards have some requirements to assess the extreme events and extreme weather events. There are considerations about the black start planning, just to make sure, worst come to worst, if you lose the system, you need to be able to have black start resources to be able to restore your system. And I think Dan from Haj touched on that in his speech as well. There's a real-time and the event response piece when it comes to their actual real-time actions and coordinations with the industry. And it includes coordinations with the transmission, generation, and distribution owners, but also more broadly within the province with the management agencies, with the natural gas companies as we go through those extreme events. And on the recovery side, we have our restoration plans and business continuity plans. And those are really meant to essentially help us to recover and restore the system and go back to the normal conditions. There was quite a bit of talk about the supply adequacy. So supply adequacy for me, it's the long-term supply adequacy that, before it comes to the real-time operation, you really have to look at your system, you look at your resources to make sure that you have enough supply to meet the demand. But there is also the real-time aspect in terms of making sure that when you go to the real-time operations, when you go to those supply shortfall situations, you have means and mitigations in place to be able to meet the demand. And event analysis, just around what we have learned and what we can improve in that space. And there are some activities kind of across the entire spectrum. So natural gas coordination, there are some planning aspects, there are real-time aspects around that. And there's also a recovery aspect just to coordinate, and be mindful of all of those interdependency between the natural gas and electricity system. And then last but not the least, there is the Alberta reliability standards and AESO rules. So depending on standards and rules, there are some standards that talk about your preparedness, planning. There are some standards and rules about your event response, and also some standards with requirements for the recovery and restoration. So all that was a pitch to the ongoing activity that we have at the AESO, which is called the Climate Resiliency White Paper. So what we are really doing in that space is just to essentially kind of help put together all of those pieces of the puzzle together for our stakeholders to understand what we as the AESO are doing and what we have planned for the future, but also shed some light in terms of review some best practices and learn from the others and share those experiences and observations with the industry. So there's a link on that for that on this slide, but also if you just Google the AESO Climate Resiliency White Paper, it would show up in your Google search if you want to get more information. So I think with that, I think I'm already over time, so I'll hand it over to.
I'm going to leave this one open, so if anyone can feel free to jump in on this one. Will Chow has asked, under the premise that power markets equals generation planning, how do we plan for resiliency in the space of generation?
I'll start because I don't think it's actually related. Yeah. Because I think people actually think that it is related. There's this whole notions that, if you are an economist, I'm sorry, but I'm going to say something that is often confusing because people always say that, when there is demand, there's always a supply, and energy market could actually shows that oh, it's going to be an indication that you're actually going to be building stuff. The reality is, no. Nobody has been building any new capacity these days, and this is why you are seeing all the data centers says that, hey, I want to build my own generations, because nobody's really building any generation this day. I'm just reflecting in California, for example. I think Brandon would talk about the rolling black, or somebody talked about the rolling blackout in California in 2020, August 2020, and that's because everybody thinks that we have enough generations with a planning reserve margin of 15%. But in reality is, no, nobody built generations. And then we have rolling blackout. And then guess how many generations have we put since 2020 to 2025? In 5 years, we put 25,000 megawatt of generations resources in 5 years. And we only, have 50,000 megawatt of load. So I think a lot of people think that the markets or the economy is going to drive this investment. And the reality is, no. In reality is people often takes crisis to have a generations comes in. Now the question then becomes, well, what type of generations do you have, and what type of thing that you need? Now that's actually a very good question, because at least in the California, maybe this is the same with Alberta or any other states, is the government get to choose what type, the politics and the government get to choose what type of a generation that they want to put in. In California, they want to have a renewable portfolio, so they want to have everything's clean. Well, okay, you cannot really just live with solar and battery, because there's not enough land to put solar. Even though it's always sunny in California, you don't have enough land to put solar to make that happen. So we have to then think about having diverse portfolio and having a lot of the wind generations in there. Well, there's not enough land to put wind generation, so now we start putting wind generation in New Mexico, and we built the largest DC line from New Mexico all the way down to Arizona, and we're looking at Wyoming and all those other stuff. And then somebody, I think Dan was talking about the fact that there is no interregional planning. It's pretty sad, actually. But I think people are really, at the end of the day, in the investment for the new resources created this challenges where you all hear about the vulnerability of resource adequacy or energy adequacy. And I think that's a real issue right now.
I'd like to weigh in on this one. There's a number of factors in play, I think has been pointed out. And in terms of supply diversity is the best friend to reliability, and possibly by extension resilience, I think of common mode droughts. So if we hit a drought that was common to both BC and Manitoba in a Western Canadian trading bloc, we would have a supply constraint. And so part of that might be solved through transmission, not necessarily the question that was asked, but it would have implications. And what does that mean? Kind of chaos and constraint. If there is constraints over what we can build, so for example, coal, that means that's one variable taken out of the equation for good reason, but then the replacement to take that on with different capacity factor, no inertia, and no dispatchability means that we now have a generation planning issue which extends across the overall system transmission planning spectrum.
Go ahead.
I look at resilience from the point of view of existing facility, and I think that one important step is that we augmented this grid with sensor, with tools that allow us to monitor at runtime what is going on, and also inject aspect of inference and machine learning and AI that allow us to guess or with certain level of uncertainty, or with a low level of uncertainty, whether there is a potential damages or interruption of power on the grid. So data collection, data inference, that is an important step that needs to be done and shared.
I guess from my perspective, in the morning we talked about the winter storm Uri that happened in ERCOT back in 2021. And I think one of the outcomes after this event was that we developed, or NERC developed, a few reliability standards, including EOP 12, which has some requirements for the generation facilities to have antifreeze protection and essentially to make sure that the facilities are more resilient to the extreme cold events. So I think there are some aspects in the standards that require generation facilities to be more resilient. But I think on top of that, the balancing authorities and system operators also have a role in play from the long-term supply adequacy to make sure that at the end of the day, as we go through different type of extreme events, there is enough supply to meet the demand. And if there is not, there has to be some mitigations in place.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm glad you say so EOP 12 though, because Jamie can tell me that this is something that all the industry hated it, and we actually didn't. The cold weather standard for the EOP 12, it was like the hardest thing to get through, and then at the end of the day, FERC basically says, you got to do it. And NERC says, yep, you got to do it. And everybody was upset, but we have to do it. But in reality, it's very useful. But that goes back to my point originally, is that sometimes it's all about money. People don't want to really do what's the right thing to do because it's expensive. And it takes crisis to actually get things done. It's sad, but somebody earlier today mentioned that we are not really planning, we are reacting. And it's sad. It's really sad. So I'm actually excited about new generations. Maybe they don't have to. Maybe they can learn from our mistake and not have to be reacting and can actually plan, regardless of where the money comes from. So somebody have to make the money first, I guess.
Yeah, no, it's certainly interesting. I mean, you hit a good point about the whole. It's about the money in a lot of instances. And you're right. It's like you tell someone that they need to do something according to a grid card, and immediately everyone's up in arms. And the first question there was, how much is it going to cost me? And you go, okay, well, I understand how much it's going to cost you, but how much does it cost you if you don't do it? Is the real question that needs to be asked. And this is one of the interesting things. I even had a conversation with someone yesterday, and I mentioned that one of the thresholds we're using is in relation to like risks, right? And the one risk I put out, I'm not going to say what it is publicly, but it's only 2%. And they're like, that's extremely low. Like why is it so low? And it's like, in the context of what it was for, that's actually high. So, and and the reason for that is, what is the consequence if it does happen? And that's where it becomes very interesting. And balancing that can be extremely difficult. So, but yeah. I'm going to move into the next question here. And it says, with 90% of generation relying on natural gas, what is done to protect the gas distribution system against extreme events, cyber attacks, et cetera, et cetera? I'm curious if anyone has anything on that. I'm assuming this one's more towards you, Mahdi.
Yeah, I assume that too. So with respect to what we have in Alberta right now, there are redundancy built in the natural gas system that essentially we have multiple pipelines running in parallel, and we are not having the same level of risk that maybe other jurisdictions have in terms of single radial pipelines feeding multiple transmission facilities and all that. But it doesn't mean that we are in the blue sky and we are risk-free. We've had situations, as I mentioned, that in the cold snap events, things break all the time, including the compressors along the gas transportation system. And as it happens, it means that the consumers, including the power generation companies, have to be curtailed. Depending on the type of contract they have, interruptible or firm. Usually interruptibles get curtailed first. But even, we have seen some situations where the firm, the generation facilities with the firm contract get curtailed as well. So I think from our perspective, I think it's really important to have that close coordination with the natural gas delivering company in Alberta. So in Alberta, we have NGTL, which is the TC Energy subsidiary of natural gas. And in a real-time operation, we have a very close and good collaboration in terms of when something is happening on the natural gas side, they let us know that, hey, we have this issue on the compressor system. Here's the generation facilities that we have to potentially curtail. And then for us on the real-time side, as we go through the supply shortfall situation, we also let our counterpart know on the NGTL side. So I think, it's about having the awareness as best as possible in the real-time and coordination and communication. And and also, to the extent possible, mitigating those impacts from the real-time operations perspective.
Oh, all right. So gas and electric coordination is actually a very important thing. We've heard it quite a bit, just from our own experience back in 2016. So in California, we have a lot of big, humongous gas storage systems. So if you have gas storage system like AESO Canyon in Southern California, life is actually nicer because you actually have storage. If you don't have storage, it's kind of annoying. But building gas storage is really hard now. But so gas and electric coordination is very important. We've been doing that for quite some time now, since 2016, when we learned about the issue in the AESO Canyon. And I think it goes back to this whole concepts of don't put all your eggs in one basket. I think our natural gas system is being used quite a bit for our natural gas unit, but the pipeline and the gas move in 30 kilometers an hour, if any of that, and the electricity move in the speed of light. So if you use your electricity too much, then you are actually draining the pipeline, and that's actually not good either. So yeah, there's a lot of coordinations between gas and electricity. Now, the challenge though, gas does not have the same requirement as electricity. I don't know in Alberta, but I don't think anywhere gas actually is required to operate for N-1. You've heard about N-1 in the electric industry. I don't think that's the case for the gas. So if you lose a pipeline, there's no requirement that you could actually still cover all your firm load. And by the way, natural gas unit is not a firm load, so they can get curtailed anytime.
If I can add something about not putting your eggs in a single basket, which is a wise approach, but it had complexity in monitoring, and we have not the capability of putting people at every single facility, training them specifically. I go back to the importance of monitoring through sensory, through collection of data and analysis of data runtime. So it put the urgency for us to consider at this ecosystem of monitoring and inference of what is going on. The coordination is not just us running across facility, but is having in place infrastructure that do that for us.
A couple years ago, actually more than that, almost 10 years ago, there was a natural gas constraint during Christmas when it was about 35 below north of Edmonton. So the distribution system couldn't keep up. And there was some worry about whether or not we'd be able to service people. And for those folks that maybe aren't aware, natural gas is hugely important in the wintertime still, because that's what causes home heating and home water heating to take place. Kind of referring back to what I was mentioning earlier and the modes of energy, as we start to shift around the energy usage, where it comes from, how it's consumed. Now we're starting to play in an intricate I would say back and forth between certain modes of energy. And when you move from one to another, whichever direction you're going, if there's not a complementary planning process, so for example, does the natural gas transmission and distribution system need to have a complementary response within the electric system or potentially a hydrogen system? Now we're starting to look at sort of these interlacing or synchronizations of energy modes. And without paying attention to that from a planning perspective, either by consumption or production or some other method, transportation, we're probably going to run into a bit of a stump.
Yeah, I'm on the distribution side, so I don't do a lot on the generation side. I don't really have a lot to add in that situation. So I thank my fellow panelists on this one. I'm going to move into the next one, though, if no one has anything. All right, so do you see wildfire smoke that would discount solar generation to become more and more a resource adequacy issue in places like California that rely heavily on solar? That's the next question.
Can you repeat that question for me, please?
Yeah, okay. It's a bit of a mouthful, yeah. Do you see wildfire smoke that would discount solar generation to become more and more of a resource adequacy issue in places like California that rely heavily on solar?
Yeah, so yes, Is that enough? So wildfire is very interesting. I mean, I was just talking about to PhD candidate that's talking about how modeling and everything is about wildfire. Wildfire is very interesting because I don't know if you know this, it created its own atmosphere, right? It definitely created its own atmosphere. And it basically created a lot of impacts, and people are still studying that impacts of everything else. So when you have a lot of wildfire, there's the impact to any PV solar is it's created its own, basically its own atmosphere, and it has the smoke, and the smoke is just like a cloud cover. When you have a cloud cover, you have a reduction of any solar, not just rooftop solar, PV solar. So we in California actually have noticed this because of all the wildfire that we had. So we actually have a different solar forecasting system so that we could actually take the input of the data again of this, what are they calling it now? Basically, is a high def resolutions of what the atmosphere is going to look like beyond just the cloud, because now you have to model that that smoke, basically. So we've been doing that for a few years now, and it's getting better and better. So it does impact that. So that's the impact of wildfire in rooftop solar, and you will have that reduction that is in there. The wildfire also impact the transmission side, right? So wildfire, if there is already fires underneath the transmission line, basically the fires created there, it's dry, and it's basically ionized the atmosphere, and then it becomes more conductive for electricity, so then the transmission tower could actually spark, and you just lose that. Or nowadays, what we're hearing that Brandon was talking about, people are actually proactively de-energizing transmission line for when there is a fire nearby because of all the embers or all the smoke that's going in there that could spark another fire in that area, in the other side of the transmission line. So when that happens, then you potentially leave a community in the dark, because now they're no longer could be supported by the transmission side. So it's kind of interesting, because what happened then, if you're leaving a community in the dark, you're reducing load. If you are also having rooftop solar, it's also reducing load. In California, when the smoke's covering it, it's also reducing temperature. So then your load is actually reduced. I have never thought about it, but it happens. So it gets really complicated and really confusing. So it really it's really forcing us to use a lot more real-time data and satellite imagery to do both the production forecasting and load forecasting.
Extend on that a little bit. I worked on a project a couple of years ago in Europe on a control center of the future. And the idea was, as the decarbonization was taking place, what kind of forecasting would you need to feed adequate data into the control center to be able to keep the real-time singularity in place? And as we got deeper into the project, what we discovered was issues like this. If smoke or clouds are in the air, what do you see in terms of irradiation on solar panels? What do you see production from wind? We ended up putting together, as a test, as a scenario, a 500 meter by 500 meter cell structure across several 100,000 kilometers with met stations pulling in data like degrees heating, degrees cooling, the amount of cover of cloud, which could be extended to smoke, what kind of wind conditions would there be, in addition to the standard forecasting, which is what kind of load forecast is there. So it's a supply forecast, a weather forecast, and a weather-ish kind of forecast.
I have nothing to add.
All right, cool. Yeah, that was a good question. I'm just going to move down the list again. Oh, that's unfortunate. This one's for me. The question is, have you studied stable islanded microgrid formation to enhance resiliency? Yeah. So when it comes to microgrids, one of the most interesting things is you really can't do one without doing a proper electromagnetic transient simulation to get an idea of what's actually happening. Now, the difficulty with it is you actually have to have a real strong understanding of what your load is. So we're going back to like the whole data thing again. Is that you need to have a very strong understanding. In the case of Waterton, it was all like commercial buildings essentially. So like there was no complex loads associated to it. So it was actually fairly simplistic when we were doing it. But if you start adding like a complicated load into it, you need to model it really well. Otherwise, it essentially causes a problem. One of my contacts that I have over in the States, he was talking about a microgrid they did, and they have a regenerative braking load in it, and they didn't compensate for it. And every time this load kicked in, it actually collapsed the island. So it failed. I think they tested it 10 times and it failed 10 times in a row before they stopped testing it. And they went back to the drawing board to try and fix it. And like we have the same thing in our territory. I don't know if any of you have seen what a load from a ski hill looks like. It's crazy. Like the swings go from, it goes minus 400 kilowatts because it's pulling power into, suddenly it's pushing 400 kilowatts in the space of like milliseconds. These loads can be fairly complicated. But I guess the long and the short of the answer to that in that situation is yes, we do study it. You have to study it from an electromagnetic transient standpoint, but it can be difficult to study because you need to go and get a lot of information to really have an understanding of how that system actually works. In terms of resiliency metrics, that's a whole different conversation. I definitely do not have enough time to go into that. So I think we're right on time. So I'm gonna call it there.